He, a skeptical tycoon, doubted goodness. She, a pure and innocent young woman, a vendor at a farmer's market, seen as simple. On a visit, Richard observes her. He sees her honesty, dedication, and dignity. Confronted with this different kind of beauty, the millionaire falls in love with her essence, feeling an overwhelming desire to protect her. Prepare for a twist where society and the past will try to destroy the tycoon's love for the market vendor. But the purity and goodness of this love will prove that essence is the true treasure. Watch this story to the end. You'll be amazed. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment. We post videos like this every day. Continuing. The Saturday morning sun bathed the Union Square Green Market in a golden light, transforming the colorful stalls into a vibrant mosaic. Emily Carter carefully arranged the cherry tomatoes in small wicker baskets, her delicate hands organizing each product as if it were a work of art. At 25, she had learned that beauty was in the simple details, in the perfect color of a bell pepper, in the fresh aroma of basil, in the sincere smile offered to each customer. "Emily, honey, can you take these preserves to Mrs. Henderson?" The loving voice of her mother, Susan, echoed through the stalls. Emily nodded, wiping her hands on the floral apron she wore over a simple light blue cotton dress. It was the same dress she'd been wearing for 3 years, but she kept it impeccable, just as she kept her dignity intact, despite the financial difficulties the family faced. The Carter family's stall was small, but organized with love. 3 generations worked side by side. Grandpa Joe, with his 80 years and calloused hands that could still carry heavy crates. Susan, who woke up at 4 in the morning to prepare the homemade preserves. And Emily, who had dropped out of college when her father suffered a work accident, leaving the family without their main source of income. "Honey, you have to go to the bank on Monday," Susan murmured quietly so that Grandpa Joe wouldn't hear. "The mortgage is late again." Emily felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but kept her smile. She always kept her smile. It was her way of protecting her family from her own worries, her way of making people see light where there was only silent struggle. On the other side of town, in a penthouse apartment on Park Avenue that occupied 2 entire floors, Richard Sterling finished his 3rd cup of coffee while reviewing financial reports. The panoramic view of New York City stretched before him through the enormous glass windows, but his dark eyes barely registered the cityscape. At 38, Richard had built an empire that few could fully comprehend. His company, Sterling, investments, controlled stakes in dozens of other companies, from tech startups to large real estate developers. "Mr. Sterling, your personal trainer is waiting in the private gym," announced Jessica, his personal assistant, through the intercom. Richard dismissed the appointment with a tired gesture. He was exhausted, not physically but in a depth that not even he could name. Each day was a repetition of the previous. Meetings with people who smiled too much, dinners in expensive restaurants where conversations revolved around money and status, stunning women who were more interested in his bank account than in any word that came out of his mouth. The previous week, during a routine checkup, Dr. Michael Davis had been direct. "Richard, your blood pressure is through the roof. You need to slow down, find activities that connect you with something real, authentic. How about starting to do your own shopping? Go to a farmer's market, walk in a park." The suggestion had sounded ridiculous at the time. Richard Sterling didn't do shopping. He had people for that. But that Saturday morning, something impelled him to leave the house without a defined destination. Maybe it was the loneliness that weighed on his shoulders like a lead coat, or maybe it was the echo of the doctor's words in his mind. When the driver suggested the Union Square Green Market, Richard almost changed his mind. But something, a long dormant curiosity, made him nod positively. The black Mercedes stood out like an exotic bird among the popular cars parked on the narrow streets of the neighborhood. Richard got out of the vehicle, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian linen shirt, feeling completely out of place. The noise, the intense smells, the voices that mingled in a chaotic symphony, everything was the opposite of the controlled environment he was used to. That's when he saw her. Emily was behind her small stall, patiently explaining to an elderly woman the properties of each type of pepper she sold. Her light brown hair was tied in a simple ponytail, some rebellious strands escaping and dancing in the wind. When she smiled at the customer, Richard felt something strange happen in his chest. As if a long-locked door had suddenly opened, he approached slowly, pretending to examine the fruits of a neighboring stall, but his eyes remained fixed on her. Emily treated each customer as if they were special, offered tastings of the homemade preserves, laughed genuinely at the jokes of the older patrons. There was no calculation in her gestures, no studied performance. She was simply real. "Can I help you?" Her voice surprised him. Emily had approached, carrying a small basket with exceptionally red tomatoes. Richard turned around, and for a moment lost the ability to speak. Up close, she was even more stunning. Her eyes were of a warm and deep brown, and there was a purity in her gaze that he had never encountered before. There was no calculated interest, nor the greedy gleam he knew so well, just genuine curiosity and a natural kindness. "I was just looking around," he managed to say, feeling ridiculously nervous. Emily smiled, and Richard was sure he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. "They're organic, picked yesterday at my uncle's farm," she explained, offering the basket. "Would you like to try one?" It was a simple question about tomatoes, but for Richard it sounded like an invitation to a completely new world. A world where things had real flavor, where people were genuine, where perhaps he could find something he didn't even know he was looking for. When their hands touched briefly during the exchange of the basket, Richard felt an electric current run through his entire body. Emily blushed slightly, her eyes glancing away for an instant before returning to his. At that moment, in front of the simple stall, surrounded by the joyful chaos of the market, the tycoon Richard Sterling knew that his life had just changed forever. Richard bought 3 baskets of tomatoes, 2 of bell peppers, and all the jars of preserves that Emily had available. He knew it was a ridiculous exaggeration. He barely cooked and had a cook who took care of all the meals. But he couldn't bring himself to leave that stall. Every minute he spent talking to Emily was like a breath of fresh air in a suffocating life. "Do you own a restaurant?" asked Emily, intrigued by the amount of produce he was buying. There was something different about this man. His clothes were clearly expensive. The watch on his wrist was worth more than her family's entire monthly income, but his eyes carried a sadness that she recognized. It was the same loneliness she sometimes saw reflected in the mirror. "No, it's for home," replied Richard, avoiding her gaze. How could he explain that he was buying all this just to prolong the conversation? "I live alone." The confession escaped without him realizing it, and Emily felt a pang of compassion. Alone in a city like New York, with all that money, it must be a terrible loneliness. "Well then, you're going to be eating tomatoes for a whole week," she joked, trying to ease the tension that she felt growing between them. There was something magnetic about that elegant stranger, something that made her want to get to know him better, but also scared her deeply. Richard laughed, a genuine sound that hadn't come out of his throat in a long time. "Maybe I should come back here next week to buy something different." "The market is every Saturday," said Emily, feeling her cheeks warm, always at the same time. During the following days, neither of them could forget the encounter. Richard found himself thinking about Emily during important meetings, remembering the way she delicately held the tomatoes as if they were small treasures. He had already been with stunning women, models, businesswomen, socialites, but none had left such a deep mark on his memory. There was something pure about Emily that attracted him almost desperately, as if she were an antidote to the poison that ran in his veins. Emily, in turn, found herself distracted during work, thinking about the mysterious man who had bought half of her stall. Susan noticed the change in her daughter's behavior. "What is it, honey? You've been on cloud nine since Saturday." "It's nothing, Mom," Emily lied, but her mind constantly returned to those dark eyes and the sadness she had seen in them. There was something about that man that made her want to comfort him, to discover what hurt him so much. On Wednesday, Richard made an impulsive decision. He called Jessica and cancelled all the afternoon meetings, going out in search of the market. He needed to see her again, even if it was just to confirm that he hadn't imagined the connection he felt. But when he arrived at Union Square, he found only the empty streets and the spots where the stalls used to be. Reality hit him like a punch. He didn't even know where she lived, what her full last name was, how to find her outside that. In context, the feeling of helplessness irritated him deeply. Richard Sterling could get anything he wanted, companies, properties, people, but he couldn't find a market vendor. Emily also struggled against confusing feelings. During the week, she found herself doing her hair more carefully, choosing the least faded dress, applying a little of the lipstick she had received from her cousin at Christmas. But why? For a stranger who probably wouldn't even come back. For a man who clearly belonged to a completely different world than hers. "You're wasting your time with fantasies, honey," Susan warned. On Friday night, noticing how Emily obsessively checked if they had enough products for the following Saturday. "Men like that don't come back to places like this." Her mother's words hurt because Emily feared they were true. What kind of future could exist between a market vendor and a man who wore expensive watches? The social difference between them was an unbridgeable gap. The following Saturday, Emily arrived at the market with her heart racing, pretending to herself that she wasn't waiting for anyone in particular. She organized her stall with redoubled care, arranged the products in an even more attractive way, and tried to focus on work. At 10 in the morning, when she had completely given up, she saw the black Mercedes approaching slowly on the narrow street. Her heart raced uncontrollably. Richard got out of the car with the same elegance as the previous week. But this time, Emily noticed something different in his eyes. There was an anxiety that mirrored her own, a vulnerability that made him more human. "Good morning," he said, approaching the stall with a hesitant smile. "I finished all the tomatoes." "All of them?" Emily raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain a casual tone. "In 1 week?" "I made a lot of salad," replied Richard, and they both knew it was a lie. They laughed together, and Emily felt as if an invisible barrier had dissolved between them. They started talking about the products, about the weather, about trivialities that seemed to carry a much greater weight than they should. Richard discovered that Emily had studied business administration for 2 years before dropping out of college, that she loved to read in the few free hours she had, that she dreamed of expanding the family business. Emily discovered that Richard liked strong coffee, that he had lost his parents when he was young, that he had built his empire practically alone. There was a melancholy in his voice when he spoke about professional achievements that should have made him happy. "Why do you do that?" asked Richard suddenly, observing how she treated each customer with genuine attention. "Do what?" "Smile like that, as if each person was important." Emily studied him for a moment, seeing beyond the polished facade. "Because they are important. Everyone has their story, their struggles. Who am I to not recognize that?" "So, Answer hit Richard like a revelation. In his world, people were numbers, contacts, business opportunities. The idea of seeing each individual as genuinely important was revolutionary. The conversation was interrupted when a man in an expensive suit approached the stall. "Mr. Sterling, sorry to bother you, but I'm from the New York Times, David Miller, Society column. What a surprise to find you here." Richard stiffened immediately. Emily noticed the instant change in his posture, as if a mask had fallen over his face. The journalist looked at her with malicious curiosity, clearly calculating a story. "No comment," said Richard coldly, grabbing his products and preparing to leave. Sure, smiled David, already typing something on his cell phone. "Just admiring this diversification of interests." After Richard quickly walked away, Emily stood still, feeling as if she had been struck by lightning. What had just happened? Why had that journalist been so interested in seeing them talking? Susan approached, worried. "Who was that man, honey?" I don't know exactly," whispered Emily, but a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. That night, Emily searched for the name Richard Sterling on the internet using the old cell phone she shared with her mother. What she discovered left her breathless. He was one of the richest men in America, constantly photographed at social events alongside stunning women, heiresses, and businesswomen. A world completely unattainable for someone like her. On Monday, the headline in the newspaper's Society column confirmed her worst fears. Tycoon Richard Sterling finds new hobby at local farmers market. Is it a new marketing strategy or genuine romantic interest? The market's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted to interview her. Curious onlookers appeared to see the millionaire's girlfriend. Emily felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her private life had been invaded. It was then that she received a message that would change everything. Richard Sterling wanted to meet her urgently. He would wait for her at the market on Wednesday morning before the official opening, when there wouldn't be other people around. Emily looked at the paper. With the message, her hands trembling slightly, she knew she should refuse, that nothing good could come of it. But something stronger than reason prevented her from simply ignoring the request. The market was silent on Wednesday morning. Only the echo of Emily's footsteps echoing among the empty stalls. She had arrived 2 hours before the usual time, her heart beating so hard that she feared Richard might hear it when he appeared. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and had spent the night awake, alternating between anxiety and the determination to end that situation before it became even more complicated. Richard was already there, leaning against one of the columns that supported the market's roof. He looked different without the movement and life around him, younger, more vulnerable. When he saw her approaching, he straightened up. But Emily noticed that his hands were trembling slightly. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I know I shouldn't have asked this." "You really shouldn't have," replied Emily, maintaining a safe distance between them. "Did you see the newspaper?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment, guilt etched on his face. "I did, and I want to apologize. I didn't think that. I didn't imagine this would happen." "Of course you didn't think." Emily's voice came out harsher than she intended. "Men like you don't think about the consequences for people like me." The accusation hit Richard hard, but he knew he deserved it. "You're right. I've lived in a bubble for so long that I forgot how the real world works. But you need to know that I didn't seek this out. The media attention, the exposure, I hate it as much as you do." Emily studied him, trying to find signs of falsehood, but she only saw sincerity. "Then why did you come back? Why didn't you just forget you met me?" Richard took a step forward, and Emily could see the internal struggle reflected in his eyes. "Because I can't forget. I tried, Emily. God knows, I tried, But you showed me something that I thought didn't exist anymore. And what is that? She asked against her own curiosity. Authenticity, kindness without ulterior motive, a person who treats others well simply because that's how you should treat people. Richard ran a hand through his hair, disarranging his perfect hairstyle. You have no idea how rare that is in my world. Emily felt her anger slowly dissipating, replaced by a painful understanding. And I have no idea how complicated this could make my life. My family is being harassed by reporters. Neighbors are asking questions. People at the market look at me differently. I can fix this, said Richard quickly. I have lawyers, press advisors. I can make this story disappear. With more money? With more power? Emily shook her head. You really don't understand, do you? It's not about making it disappear. It's about the fact that we're from completely different worlds. Richard moved closer, and Emily could smell the subtle and expensive cologne he wore. What if we weren't? What if I could find a way to shorten that distance? How? The question escaped before Emily could contain it. I don't know yet, but I know that I can't just go back to my life and pretend you don't exist. Not after seeing what a person can be when they are truly good. Emily felt tears prickling her eyes. There was a vulnerability in Richard's voice that touched something deep in her heart. Why is this so important to you? Richard hesitated, looking at his own hands. When he spoke, his voice was laden with an old pain. When I was 17, my parents died in a car accident. I inherited everything, the company, the money, the responsibilities. Overnight, I became a target. Emily remained silent, feeling that he needed to talk. People started to see me differently. Friends became opportunists. Girlfriends became fortune hunters. I learned to distrust every smile, every affectionate gesture, every "I love you." Richard raised his eyes to her. Until I met you, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw someone who didn't know who I was and was still kind to me. Emily felt her heart clenching. The story explained a lot about the sadness she saw in his eyes, about the cautious way he related to the world. Richard, I know it's selfish of me to want to be part of your life, he continued. I know I can only bring complications, but I can't just disappear without at least trying. Emily looked at that powerful man, seeing for the first time the wounded boy he hid behind the armor of success and control. Part of her wanted to comfort him, hug him, say that everything would be all right. But the practical part, the one that had learned to survive with dignity despite the difficulties, warned her about the dangers. I need time to think, she said finally. This is all too much. It's too much for me. Richard nodded, but there was despair in his eyes. Can I keep buying here on Saturdays? No pressure, no expectations. Just don't cut me completely out of your life yet. Emily knew she should say no. She knew that each meeting would make it harder to maintain the necessary distance. But when she looked at him, she saw something she recognized in herself, the desperate need not to be alone in the world. Only as a customer, she said, trying to sound firm. Nothing more. Only as a customer, agreed Richard. But the relief in his voice was palpable. When they said goodbye, Emily walked home with slow steps, knowing that she had just made a promise that would be impossible to keep, because it was already too late to pretend that Richard Sterling was just another customer. And deep in her heart, she feared that it was also too late to protect herself from a love that could destroy everything she had built. That night, alone in her small room, Emily discovered something about herself that scared her. For the first time in her life, she was willing to risk everything for someone, and that terrified her more than any newspaper headline. The following Saturdays became a careful dance between closeness and distance. Richard arrived punctually at 9 in the morning, bought his produce with the seriousness of someone choosing stocks on Wall Street, and prolonged the conversations as much as possible without seeming intrusive. Emily, in turn, fought against the smile that automatically appeared on her face when she saw him approaching, pretending that her heart didn't race every time their hands touched during the exchange of money. It was the fourth Saturday when everything changed. Emily was organizing the last preserves of the day when she felt a sharp pain in her chest. The world around her began to spin, and she leaned on the counter, trying to catch her breath. The pain intensified, radiating down her left arm, and she understood with horror that something was very wrong. "Mom," she tried to call, but her voice came out as a weak whisper. Richard, who was a few feet away examining some mangoes, immediately realized that something had happened. Emily was pale, sweating cold, her lips slightly bluish. Without hesitating, he ran to her. "Emily, what's happening?" I can't breathe," she murmured, grabbing his arm with desperate force. Susan appeared running, her face filled with panic. "My daughter! Oh my God, what is it?" Richard didn't think twice. He picked Emily up in his arms, ignoring her weak protests, and shouted to his driver, "Hospital now!" The drive to New York Presbyterian Hospital was a blur of run-red lights and improvised sirens. Richard held Emily against his chest the whole way, whispering words of encouragement as she struggled to maintain consciousness. Susan, sitting next to them, prayed in a low voice, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with me, Emily," repeated Richard, his voice breaking with each word. "Please, stay with me." In the emergency room, Richard used all his power and influence to ensure that Emily was immediately attended to by the best doctors in the hospital. He remained outside the examination room like a sentinel, refusing to leave, even when Susan tried to convince him that he didn't need to stay. "Are you family?" asked a nurse, filling out papers. "I am," replied Richard without hesitation, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. 3 hours later, Dr. Sarah Johnson came out of the room with a serious expression. Ms. Carter suffered a severe anxiety attack combined with extreme exhaustion. The tests show that she is severely malnourished and dehydrated. When was the last time she had a full meal? Susan lowered her head, ashamed. Things have been tough. Emily always gives her food to me and her father." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. While he wasted fortunes on dinners he barely touched, Emily was literally starving to feed her family. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Yes, but she needs rest, proper nutrition, and less stress. I'm going to prescribe some medication, but the most important thing is that she takes better care of herself." When they were finally able to see her, Emily was awake but weak, connected to an IV drip. Her eyes filled with tears when she saw Richard standing in the doorway. "You stayed," she whispered. "Of course I stayed," he replied, approaching the bed. "You gave me the biggest scare of my life." Susan discreetly left to get coffee, leaving them alone. Emily tried to sit up, but Richard gently stopped her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, holding her hand carefully. "About the financial difficulties?" Emily looked away, ashamed. "Because it's not your problem, and because I didn't want you to think I was interested in your money." The brutal honesty of the answer broke Richard's heart. "Emily, look at me." She obeyed reluctantly. "I want to help, not as charity, not as an obligation, but because you care about me in a way that no one ever has, and I want to reciprocate that. Richard, you barely know me. I know that you give your food to your family to eat. I know that you smile even when you're suffering. I know that you treat each person as if they were precious, even when no one treats you that way. His voice grew more intense. "And I know that for the first time in 20 years, I care about someone's well-being more than my own protection." Emily felt tears streaming down her face. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel seen, really seen, perhaps for the first time in her life. "I'm scared," she confessed in a whisper, "of me, of you, of your world, of not being enough." Emily took a deep breath. "And I'm afraid of falling in love with someone who might simply decide that I'm not worth the complication." Richard moved closer, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen. "Emily, I've already decided. You're worth any complication, any problem, any scandal. I care about you in a way that scares me." Before Emily could answer, Richard leaned in and kissed her forehead gently. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with an intimacy that left them both trembling. "Let me take care of you," he whispered against her skin, "at least until you recover completely." Emily closed her eyes, knowing that she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But at that moment, feeling the warmth of his skin so close, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes, she couldn't find the strength to refuse. "Just until I recover," she agreed. But they both knew it was a lie. When Susan returned and found Richard holding her daughter's hand, she saw something that made her rethink all her objections. For the first time in years, Emily looked protected, cared for, loved. And Richard, that powerful man who could have anything in the world, looked at Emily as if she were his greatest treasure. But neither of them noticed the paparazzi photographer hidden in the hospital corridor, capturing every intimate moment through the window of the room. The photos of Richard kissing Emily's forehead, of their hands intertwined, of the loving look between them, were already being sent to every newsroom in the city. The storm that was approaching would be much worse than either of them could imagine. The photos plastered the covers of 3 gossip magazines the next morning. Tycoon and the Market Girl, Forbidden Romance in the Hospital, screamed the main headline, accompanied by intimate images that transformed a moment of genuine care into a public spectacle. Emily, still recovering at home, saw the magazines when her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought them over with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised concern. "Honey, you need to see this," said Susan, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "They're making up all kinds of things." The articles weren't just invasive, they were cruelly and intentionally distorted. They spoke of an opportunist who had seduced the billionaire, of a well-planned trap using a staged illness, and speculated about how much money Emily was trying to extract from Richard. One of the magazines even suggested that the Carter family had orchestrated the whole encounter. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters offered sums of money for exclusive interviews. Photographers hid on street corners near the family's house, and Emily found herself a prisoner in her own home. Richard, upon reading the headlines in his office, felt a fury that he hadn't experienced in years. He immediately activated his legal team, but his lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was straight to the point. "Richard, I can sue for defamation, but that's just going to generate more publicity, and there's something more worrying." Mr. Thompson slid a folder across the table. "Your Aunt Eleanor is mobilizing the company's board." Richard opened the folder and found meeting minutes, emails, and documents that chilled his blood. Eleanor Sterling, his father's younger sister and co-inheritor of a small percentage of the company, was claiming that he had become emotionally unstable and incapable of making rational decisions for the good of the corporation. "She's using your involvement with Emily as evidence that you've lost your mind," explained Mr. Thompson. "According to her, a man in your position who publicly engages with a market vendor clearly isn't fit to lead a business empire." "That's ridiculous," roared Richard. But he knew that the argument, however cruel, could have legal force in a corporate dispute. There's more, continued Mr. Thompson, hesitant. She's hired a private investigator. They're digging into Emily's life and the lives of her entire family, looking for anything that can be used against you both. Richard felt the world collapsing around him. Everything he had built, the entire empire that was his parents' legacy, was being threatened. And worse still, Emily and her family were being dragged into a dirty game that they didn't even know existed. That afternoon, he went to Emily's house in Union Square. The modest two-story home was surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers and reporters. Richard had to use all his authority to break through the human barrier and get to the door. Emily greeted him with eyes swollen from crying. "Did you see?" "I saw everything," he said, quickly entering before more photos were taken. "Emily, we need to talk." The small living room seemed even smaller, with Richard's presence there. Susan offered coffee, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emily sat on the worn sofa, wrapping her arms around her knees like a frightened child. "There are things you need to know about me, about my family," began Richard, sitting cautiously next to her. "My company isn't just mine. There's a board, and there are people who wouldn't hesitate to take me down if they saw an opportunity." He told her about Eleanor, about the threats to the company's control, about the investigators. With each word, Emily grew paler. "They're going to try to find something on you, on your family," he explained, his voice laden with guilt. "Anything they can twist and use against us." Emily stood up abruptly, walking to the small window that overlooked the street. Outside, there were still people waiting, cameras ready to capture any movement. "So this will never end," she said, her voice breaking. "Even if I walk away from you now, they'll keep chasing me, looking for ways to humiliate me." Richard approached, from behind, wanting to touch her but not daring to. "Not if you let me protect you for real." Emily turned around, meeting his eyes. "How?" "Come live with me," he said, the words coming out before he could filter them. "You and your family. I have security, privacy. I can guarantee you'll be at peace while I resolve this situation." "Richard," Emily shook her head. "You don't understand what you're asking. If I go live with you, we'll officially become a couple in the eyes of the world. There'll be no going back." "What if I say I don't want to go back?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with an intensity that made Emily tremble. She could see in Richard's eyes that he was serious, that this wasn't just a temporary solution, but a declaration of intentions. "Your aunt, she'll use this against you. She'll say you've completely lost your mind." "Probably," agreed Richard, moving closer. "But for the first time in my life, I care more about what I want than what's politically correct." Emily felt tears burning her eyes. "What if it goes wrong? What if you wake up one day and realize you sacrificed everything for an illusion?" Richard reached out, gently touching her face. "Emily, you saved my life that first day at the market. Saved it without even knowing. If I lose everything but gain you, I'll still come out ahead." Susan, who had listened to the entire conversation, from the kitchen appeared in the doorway of the living room. "Richard, can I talk to you?" They stepped out to the small backyard. Susan looked directly into the tycoon's eyes. "My daughter is everything I hold most precious in the world," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "She's never dated seriously, never given herself to anyone. If you're playing with her, if this is just an affair—" "It's not," Richard interrupted her. "Mrs. Carter, I know I have little time to prove it, but Emily is the most important person in my life. I want to protect her, take care of her, be by her side, forever." Susan studied him in silence for a long moment. And Richard, that powerful man who could have anything in the world, looked at Emily as if she were his greatest treasure. But neither of them noticed the paparazzi photographer hidden in the hallway of the apartment building. capturing every intimate moment through the window of the penthouse. The photos of Richard kissing Emily's forehead, of their hands intertwined, of the loving look between them, were already being sent to every newsroom in the city. The storm that was approaching would be much worse than either of them could imagine. The photos plastered the covers of 3 gossip magazines the next morning. "Tycoon and the Market Girl. Forbidden romance explodes," screamed the main headline, accompanied by intimate images that transformed a moment of genuine care into a public spectacle. Emily, still recovering at home, saw the magazines when her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, brought them over with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised concern. "Honey, you need to see this," said Susan, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "They're making up all kinds of things." The articles weren't just invasive, they were cruelly and intentionally distorted. They spoke of an opportunist who had seduced the billionaire, of a well-planned trap using a staged illness, and speculated about how much money Emily was trying to extract from Richard. One of the magazines even suggested that the Carter family had orchestrated the whole encounter. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters offered sums of money for exclusive interviews, photographers hid on street corners near the family's house, and Emily found herself a prisoner in her own home. Richard, upon reading the headlines in his office, felt a fury that he hadn't experienced in years. He immediately activated his legal team, but his lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was straight to the point. "Richard, I can sue for defamation, but that's just going to generate more publicity, and there's something more worrying." Mr. Thompson slid an enfolder across the table. "Your Aunt Eleanor is mobilizing the company's board." Richard opened the folder and found meeting minutes, emails, and documents that chilled his blood. Eleanor Sterling, his father's younger sister and co-inheritor of a small percentage of the company, was claiming that he had become emotionally unstable and incapable of making rational decisions for the good of the corporation. "She's using your involvement with Emily as evidence that you've lost your mind," explained Mr. Thompson. "According to her, a man in your position who publicly engages with a market vendor clearly isn't fit to lead a business empire." "That's ridiculous," roared Richard. But he knew that the argument, however cruel, could have legal force in a corporate dispute. "There's more," continued Mr. Thompson, hesitant. "She's hired a private investigator. They're digging into Emily's life and the lives of her entire family, looking for anything that can be used against you both." Richard felt the world collapsing around him. Everything he had built, the entire empire that was his parents' legacy, was being threatened. And worse still, Emily and her family were being dragged into a dirty game that they didn't even know existed. That afternoon, he went to what was Emily's room, the penthouse. Bruno was at a crucial board meeting when Jessica entered the room with a face of paper. "Sir, I must speak with you with urgency." "I am in meetings, Jessica." "It is about Miss Emily," she whispered, and Richard immediately rose. In the hallway, Helena handed him a magazine still hot off the press. The cover showed an old photo of Paula, with approximately 15 years, next to a headline that made the blood of Bruno freeze. "The truth about the Cinderella, dark past of the girlfriend of the tycoon revealed." The story contained intimate and painful details. When Paula was 15 years old, she'd been molested by the employer of the mother, a local merchant where Conceição worked as a cleaning lady. The trauma had been kept secret by the family to protect Paula, but also because Conceição feared losing his job. The man had threatened the family, and they had moved from neighborhood in silence. "How did they achieve this?" asked Bruno, the hands trembling of anger. "There is more, sir," said Helena, showing other pages. "They interviewed the man. He denies everything and says that Paula was a problematic teenager who made up stories to call attention." Bruno felt nauseous. Someone had ransacked Paula's deepest trauma and had transformed it into public entertainment. The article suggested that Paula had history of inappropriate behavior and questioned their true intentions with Bruno. He ran home, finding Paula locked in the room, crying convulsively. Conceição was outside of the door, also in tears. "She does not want to speak with anyone," explained the mother. "It is thus since you saw the magazine." Bruno rapped delicately at the door. "Paula, I am. Please, let me enter." "Go away," she shouted of the other side. "Go away and forget me. I am not going to any place. You saw, not you saw. You saw what they wrote about me." Their voice was broken, filled with shame and despair. "Now you know what type of person I really am." Bruno punched the door with force. "Paula, open that door now." The silence that was followed was even worse than the shoutings. Finally, he heard the click of the lock. Paula was crouching in the bed, the red and swollen eyes, seeming much new that they're 20 and 5 years. "You were a child," said Bruno, sitting with care at the edge of the bed. "A child that was hurt by a monster. This does not define who you are." "It defines, yes," exploded Paula. "Now everyone will think that I am dirty, that I am not Lent, that I deserve what happened to me." Bruno tried to touch her, but she recoiled still more. "Paula, listen what I am saying." "No!" She rose abruptly, walking for the window. "You do not understand. I saved this secretly to the life all because I knew that if the people knew, they never would see me. Of the same form. And now is everything there for the whole world to judge." Before Bruno could answer, Helena appeared in the door with an expression still more grave. "Sir Valmont, their aunt is here, with lawyers, and has reporters." To the entrance of the building, Bruno went down to find Margaret Valmont in the living room, impeccably dressed, surrounded by 3 men of suit. It smiled when they saw it, but was an icy, smiling calculista. "Bruninho, dear one," said she, using the nickname of the infancy that it detested, "we need to talk about this situation. If you had anything to see with this article." "I?" Margaret pretended shock. "Dear, I do not need to invent anything. The truth has one form to come to face, not yes even." One of the lawyers went ahead. "Sir Valmont, we represent the interests of the minor stockholders of the company. This negative public exhibition is affecting the value of the shares. We have a proposal." Bruno crossed the arms, waiting. "It finished the relationship publicly. It make a statement saying that was a badly understood. A friendship badly interpreted by the means. In exchange, we guarantee that their position as CEO remain intact. And if I refuse..." Margaret stood up, smoothing the skirt. "Well, in that case, we will be forced to question their capacity of leadership. A man who leaves itself to involve in scandals that places the personal interests above the good of the company. Perhaps not is the correct person to command the Empire Valmont." The threat was clear. Bruno knew that legally they had arguments. The actions of the company had fallen 15% since the scandal burst. Investors were nervous. The reputation that had taken decades to build was being destroyed in question of days. "You have 24 hours to take the decision correct," said Margaret, walking in address to the door. "After this, we will begin the process of destitution." When they left, Bruno went up to the room, but found only Conceição arranging clothes in a suitcase. "Where is Paula?" "She was, for to although," said Conceição, without being able to look in the eyes of him. "Left a letter for you." With tremulous hands, Bruno opened the envelope. "Bruno, you gave me 3 weeks of the happiest days of my life. But I cannot be the reason for which you lose everything that you built. Her parents left that empire for you, not to be destroyed because of someone like me. Don't look for me. Please, be happy and forget that I exist. With love, Emily." Richard ran to the street, but she had already disappeared. The reporters immediately surrounded him, bombarding him with questions about the end of the romance, about whether it was true that Emily had been dumped. That night, alone in his apartment that had returned to being cold and lifeless, Richard faced the most difficult choice of his existence: save his empire or fight for the woman he loved, knowing that Emily had left precisely to protect him from having to choose. On the other side of the city, Emily cried in the small room that had been hers before meeting Richard, feeling as if she had lost not only the man she loved, but also a version of herself that she had discovered was possible. A version that was loved, protected, valued. Both believed they were doing the right thing. Neither of them knew that the separation was exactly what Eleanor Sterling had planned from the beginning. Emily spent 5 days locked in her house, ignoring the insistent calls from Richard and the reporters who still haunted the neighborhood. Susan watched her with growing concern, seeing her daughter wither before her eyes, refusing to eat properly and losing the sparkle that had always characterized her eyes. It was on Monday that everything changed. Emily was helping her mother prepare preserves in the kitchen when she overheard a conversation on the street that made her blood run cold. 2 neighbors were commenting loudly about a reward that was being offered for information about the Carter family. $50,000, honey, for whoever brings any story about that girl, said Mrs. Davis to her friend. An elegant woman came here yesterday asking about Emily's past. Emily felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone was actively hunting for information about her, paying people to destroy her reputation, and she had a terrible suspicion about who was behind it. That afternoon, against all her mother's advice, Emily put on her best outfit, a pair of dress pants borrowed from her cousin and a simple but well-pressed white blouse, and took a bus to downtown. There was one person who could have the answers she needed. David Miller, the journalist who had started all the coverage, worked in an office building downtown. Emily waited 3 hours in the reception area until he agreed to see her. Well, said David, examining her from head to toe when she entered his cramped office. The famous Emily Carter. What brings you here? I want to know who's paying. For the campaign against me, said Emily directly, surprising him with her frankness. David laughed, but Emily noticed that he avoided her gaze. I don't know what you're talking about. $50,000 for information about my family. Private investigators digging into my past. This isn't journalism, it's coordinated harassment. Look, kid, David leaned back in his chair, assuming a condescending air. You've entered a game way above your league. If there's someone who wants to take you down, it's because you've bothered powerful people. Which people? David hesitated, and Emily realized that she had hit a nerve. Let's just say that there are families in this city who have been protecting their interests for generations, and you represent a threat to those interests. Emily leaned forward. If you tell me who's behind this, I'll give you a much better story. What story? The truth about who's really manipulating Richard Sterling. David was immediately interested. Emily spent the next hour telling him everything, about the family pressure, about the threats to the company's control, about how she had been turned into a pawn in a much larger game. When she finished, David was taking notes furiously. This is a bombshell, he murmured. If I can prove that Eleanor Sterling orchestrated this campaign, can you prove it? I can try, but you need to understand, if I publish this, the war will escalate. You'll become an even bigger target. Emily thought about Richard, alone in his apartment, probably believing that she had fled out of shame or self-interest. She thought about the man who had held her hand in the hospital, who had defended her dignity, who had risked everything for her. Do what is necessary, she said, standing up. But I want justice, and I want the truth. Meanwhile, Richard had spent the last few days desperately trying to find a way to protect Emily without losing the company. His lawyers worked day and night, but the situation seemed impossible. The shares continued to fall, and Eleanor had scheduled an emergency board meeting for Friday. It was on Wednesday that Jessica entered his office with a strange expression. "Sir, there's a person here who says they have important information about your aunt." The person was Carol Wilson, a former employee of Eleanor's company who had been fired months before. She carried with her a folder full of documents, recordings, and emails. "Mr. Sterling," said Carol, nervous but determined, "your aunt hired me to coordinate the campaign against Ms. Emily. I have everything recorded, the meetings where she planned to leak information to the press, the payments to investigators, even the conversation where she said she would do whatever it takes to keep that tramp away from her nephew." Richard examined the documents with growing disbelief. Eleanor had orchestrated everything, from the first article to the investigation into Emily's past. There were even payments to people in the Carter family's neighborhood, buying information and spreading gossip. "Why are you telling me this?" asked Richard. "Because I've worked at the company for 15 years, and I know what kind of person your aunt really is. She's destroyed careers, broken up marriages, stepped on anyone who got in her way." Carol took a deep breath. "And because I saw the photos of Ms. Emily in the hospital, I saw how you looked at her. That's real love, and people like your aunt shouldn't have the power to destroy it." Richard felt a mixture of relief and fury. He finally had the weapons he needed to defend himself, but at the same time, he understood the dimension of the cruelty that had been directed against Emily. She had been attacked, humiliated, and exposed, not for something she had done, but simply for existing in his life. "There's a board meeting tomorrow," said Carol. "Eleanor intends to use the last 48 hours of scandal to convince the other members to remove you. But if you present this evidence, I can destroy her before she destroys me," completed Richard. That night, Richard called Emily repeatedly, but she didn't answer. Susan finally answered the house phone. "Mrs. Carter, I need to talk to Emily. I've discovered who's behind all of this." "Richard," Susan's voice was tired, "my daughter is very hurt. She thinks you're going to end up believing the lies they're spreading about her." "Never. I would never believe." "Then prove it," interrupted Susan. "Prove to her and to the whole world that your love is worth more than any lie." When he hung up the phone, Richard looked at the documents scattered across his desk. Eleanor Sterling had underestimated one crucial thing. He had learned to fight in the business world, and now he would fight for the woman he loved with the same fierce determination. The board meeting was in 18 hours, but before that, Richard had a plan to win back Emily and expose the truth in a way that no one would ever forget. The stage was set for the final showdown. The extraordinary meeting of the Sterling Investments Board was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Friday. Richard arrived at the company's executive boardroom 15 minutes early, carrying a leather briefcase and a determination that he hadn't felt in years. The 12 members of the board were already present, including Eleanor, who occupied her chair with the posture of someone who had already won the battle. "Richard," she smiled falsely when he entered, "I hope you've thought carefully about our conversation." Richard didn't respond, only took his place at the head of the table. "Before we begin the official meeting, I'd like to share some information that has recently come to my attention." Eleanor frowned, but maintained her composure. "Richard, I don't think this is the time for—" "On the contrary," he interrupted, her opening the briefcase. "I believe it's exactly the time." Richard began distributing copies of the documents that Carol had provided. As the members of the board read, their expressions changed from curiosity to shock, and finally to outrage. "As you can see," said Richard, his voice firm and controlled, My Aunt Eleanor coordinated a systematic campaign of defamation against an innocent woman using corporate resources and media contacts for personal gain. Eleanor tried to stand up, but Richard continued relentlessly. She paid investigators to dig up childhood traumas, bribed neighbors to invent stories, and orchestrated a media campaign with the sole purpose of forcing me to end a personal relationship. These are just unfounded allegations, protested Eleanor, but her trembling voice betrayed her. They're documented facts, replied Richard, activating a small recorder, including recordings where you instructed the investigator to find any dirt possible, regardless of whether it's true or not. Eleanor's voice echoed through the room, cold and calculating. I don't care if you have to make it up. I want that tramp out of my nephew's life, no matter the cost. The silence that followed was deafening. The members of the board looked at Eleanor with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. The issue here, continued Richard, isn't whether I'm capable of leading this company. The issue is whether we're going to allow someone to use corporate resources to persecute and humiliate innocent people for personal reasons. Mr. Harrison, the longest-serving member of the board, was the first to speak. Eleanor, this is unacceptable. If these evidences are true... They are true, confirmed Richard. And there's more. He activated another audio file where Eleanor instructed a journalist on how to twist the story of Emily's past, turning a victim into a villain. Enough, exploded Mr. Harrison. Eleanor, you are terminated from all positions in the company effective immediately, and I suggest your lawyers prepare for lawsuits for defamation and harassment. Eleanor left the room amidst a chorus of condemnations, her expression of triumph transformed into complete humiliation. But Richard barely registered the corporate victory. His mind was entirely focused on Emily. He left the meeting straight for Union Square, but the Carter family's house was empty. The neighbors reported that they had changed addresses in the middle of the night, leaving only an emergency phone number. When he finally made contact, Susan agreed to meet him at a small church downtown, away from the curious and reporters. She doesn't want to see you, said Susan when Richard arrived. She thinks she doesn't deserve the love of someone like you. Where is she? At my sister's house in the Hamptons. She said she needs time to think, to heal from what happened. Richard grabbed his car keys. What's the address? The drive to the Hamptons took 2 hours that felt like 2 eternities. Richard drove like a man possessed, mentally rehearsing everything he would say to convince Emily that she was the most important person in his life. He found her sitting alone in the garden of a small, cozy house, watching the sunset over the ocean. She didn't turn around when she heard his footsteps on the grass, but he saw her back stiffen. How did you find me? Asked Emily, her voice tired. Your mother gave me the address. After I proved that our separation was a plot orchestrated by my aunt. Emily finally turned around, and Richard saw that she had cried a lot, but there was something different in her eyes, a determination that wasn't there before. I saw the news, she said, about your aunt being fired, about the evidence of manipulation. Richard knelt on the grass beside her chair. Emily, forgive me for not realizing it sooner, for not protecting you as I should have. It's not your fault. Emily shook her head. But that doesn't change the fact that we're from different worlds, that there will always be people trying to separate us. Then let's create our own world, said Richard, taking her hands. A place where all that matters is what we feel for each other. Emily studied him in silence for a long moment. What if I say that I'm in love with you, that these 5 days away from you have been the worst of my life? What if I say that I want to try despite all the obstacles? Richard felt tears burning. His eyes. I would say that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love someone, and that I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Emily got up from the chair, and Richard imitated her. When she leaned in to kiss him, it was as if two wounded souls had finally found their healing in each other. "There's something I need to tell you," whispered Emily against his lips. "Anything." "While I was here, I made a decision. I'm going back to school. I want to finish my degree. I want to become someone who can stand by your side as a true partner, not just as a protected one." Richard smiled, holding her face between his hands. "Emily, you're already my partner. You're already my equal in everything that truly matters. Then help me become equal in what the world considers important too." 1 year later, Emily Carter graduated with a business degree on a scholarship that Richard had created anonymously for underprivileged students. She kept her maiden name and continued working at the market on Saturdays, now in an expanded stall that had become a thriving small business. The wedding ceremony was held in the same church where they had reunited, a simple but deeply moving celebration. Richard wore a simple suit, Emily a white dress that she had chosen and paid for with her own money. When the priest asked if Richard took Emily as his wife, he answered, looking directly into her eyes, "I do, with all my heart, my soul, and my life." And when Emily was asked, her response echoed through the church filled with relatives, friends, from the market, and a few of Richard's business colleagues who had learned to respect the extraordinary woman who had transformed the most powerful man they knew. "I do, promising that we will face together any storm that comes." Eleanor Sterling watched the ceremony on television from her home, where she was under house arrest, while responding to multiple lawsuits for defamation. In the end, she had lost everything, money, reputation, and family, in an attempt to destroy a love that had proven indestructible. Richard and Emily left the church hand in hand, facing the flashes of the photographers no longer as victims, but as survivors. They had learned that true love wasn't just about finding the right person, but about fighting together against everything and everyone who tried to separate them. And as they headed for their honeymoon, a simple trip to a bed and breakfast in the Berkshires, where they intended to spend 2 weeks away from everything and everyone, both knew that they had overcome not only the external obstacles, but also their own fears. Love had triumphed, not because it was easy, but because it was true.